This morning is Egbert Leigh. He is an evolutionary biologist, a graduate of Princeton University, and for a time a professor there. But he chose to invest his life in research rather than teaching, and he spent much of his life as a researcher at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Center, which worked on a small island in Panama. Now, that small island had a lot of things to attract the interest of a biologist. How are monkeys, trees, birds, fungi, bats, all kinds of things that are missing because we humans have disturbed a lot of nature. But that little island was a paradise for Egbert Leigh and other researchers. His conversational interests go beyond biology. They include science, history, theology, and he is engaged regularly with Leonard Gross to read about Anabaptism and to quiz Leonard Gross about what he knows about Anabaptism, which is considerable. He and a photographer wrote a book on that beautiful island, and it won't get around to everybody, but I'll start it, and you can see some of the wonderful photography of one of his associates that took the pictures, and Egbert wrote all the text on this sizable coffee table book. His religious heritage and current membership is in the Episcopal Church, but he's been attending Assembly Mennonite and College Mennonite, and on occasion the Sojourner Sunday School class. He lives at Manor 4 at Woodcroft. He's a widower, formerly married to Elizabeth, who's a sister of Kate Lind, who some of you go to buy greens at the farmer's market. His children attended Bethany High School and Goshen College. His background and foreground gives him an interesting perspective as he shares his faith life journey. Welcome, Bert.
Well, thank you. Uh, it was a rather surprising privilege to be invited to speak, but here I am. The talk is properly phrased as How Faith Found Me, and involves a certain amount of giving thanks to those who helped lead me to faith, which is something that one should do given the fact that All Saints' Day is around the corner. I was born in Richmond in 1940, Richmond, Virginia, that is, and baptized into the Episcopal Church. My mother's father came from a family of Episcopal clergy, and my father was a principal agnostic and taught me something like a proper sense of honor. I remember asking him about an organization, French organization called the Cagoule, which was a bunch of terrorists that probably wanted to keep Algeria French forever. And he told me they stood for violence and sacred principles, everything he hated. And for those of us who recognize that we're supposed to be following Jesus and not a bunch of principles, one might sympathize with this remark, even from an agnostic. Before I continue, are people understanding me?
Yeah.
The second remark is that I will soon be getting into territory where it's conceivable people will have urgent questions to ask, and they should be asked right off rather than waiting to the end of the talk, by which time you'll probably forgotten them. This happens to you all the time. Oh, yeah, I was lucky in that I ran and perceived no hypocrisy and ran into no anti-evolution propaganda that would have gotten in the way of believing in God. Uh, I was taught the Lord's Prayer and a bedtime prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep For some reason, we never said grace in our haste, although both sets of grandparents said it in theirs. Oh, faith became eventually an ever closer bond with my mother, but not when I was a child. Between 1944 and 51, we moved around a great deal. In 44, my mother and I were in Washington while my father was in Algiers with Lend-Lease. The year after the war, we were in Belgium, where I was taught the beginnings of how to read by French or Flemish nuns, I forget which. Uh, After the year in Belgium, we rusticated at my father's mother's place for a few months in Virginia and then off to Japan for 3 years, where my memory begins to kick in. And the thing about Japan that I remember, despite all the bomb destruction that immediately surrounded us, when we traveled around, there were sites of great beauty, a temple complex, 18th century temple complex, 100 miles north of Tokyo and mountain country, sticks out in my mind. Of course, the ever present views of Mount Fuji. But also, the Japanese have a rather ceremonious appreciation of beauty. And somehow that appreciation of beauty sunk into my mind, even though I was the typical American brat in a foreign country. And so in October 1951, uh, we moved into the house where both my parents died at very different times, 1983 and 2009. And it was full of beautiful things. It also was full of history books, which I like to read. And reading history, at least good history, teaches one to put oneself in others' shoes, which is a fairly essential thing to do if one is going to be either a serious citizen of a democratic country or even a semi-serious Christian. Uh, I had no Sunday school except for 3 disastrous weeks, which, had it not been for the fact that I was a regular attender at church, would have chased me out as fast as I could go. Granted that my wife had a completely different experience of a completely different Sunday school. I'm speaking for myself at the moment. But I was obliged to go to church, and this was a good thing because in the Episcopal Church, we did morning prayer, which meant that we had every Sunday a gospel and an Old Testament lesson and a psalm. And gospels and Old Testament lessons and psalms, especially when they're making just 52 selections, which are repeated every year, you usually get the bits that make the best, sharpest impressions on children. And we also sang good hymns, and they uh, bit of psalm that introduced college church. This morning was something that was sung in the Episcopal churches I went to, and so on. There was plenty to keep a child happy. I don't think I was never consigned to any child care crowd or anything like that. Maybe I was before I was old enough to remember. But the point is, church was, in my case, an infinitely superior substitute for Sunday school. Uh, I somehow, when I was about 12 years old, learned about Newtonian determinism. And realized that no place for God. I wasn't very happy with this, and I don't remember talking to anybody about it. And I eventually realized that this was allows the argument not just because of the invention of quantum mechanics. If we were in a Newtonian world, uh, it's complicated enough that only God could give an honest answer as to whether it was deterministic or not. But this was an obstacle. Uh, in 54, I went to boarding school. Uh, it was a lovely site east of Poughkeepsie in New York. And I had a very good biology teacher there. I would have gone into history if he hadn't come along, but he turned me into a biologist, and a biologist I stayed. Oh, I also got 4 years of French there. French being in our circles, playing very much the role in our circles that German does in yours. And what is helpful is that being here, we each have something to offer the other as a result. Uh, in 58, I went to Princeton. I majored in mathematics. First, because mathematics is beautiful, and second, because it was the language of science, and also the language of the only people who could safely look Shakespeare in the face in terms of beauty of their created work. And I'm referring to Einstein. I never did understand the general theory of relativity, but I understood a lot of other really interesting physics, and it was beautiful. I mean, education ought to be about teaching people how to appreciate beauty as much as it is about how to make a living. Also ought to be as much about teaching people how other people lived and how other people see the world. All sorts of things that are now considered a little bit too irrelevant. Uh, so I returned to faith was an accidental consequence of good and totally undeliberate Christian witness around seemingly every corner. I had a student that lived across the hall from me who introduced me to the stuff of C.S. Lewis and Jacques Ellul, Dostoevsky, and Kierkegaard, who are good people to be introduced to if one wants to understand something about faith. Oh, I took a really good course in Renaissance and Reformation, and we had to read some early Luther in it. And because the words had not been worn smooth by overuse in Sunday school, they really made an impression. Oh, and oh, by now I felt called to be an evolutionary biologist. I mean, I majored in mathematics, that I had not abandoned my interest in biology, and I went to graduate school in biology in 62 after having been taken to see something rather like tropical nature in Key Largo in Florida by a fellow student that was going into Yale. And in 63, at a biological laboratory where people in my field sort of were directed to for the summers, I met my wife, Elizabeth Hodgson, who's known to many of you here. Oh, I should have said earlier, and I will say now, if anybody, yes, I think I did. If anybody does have a question, don't hesitate to interrupt the flow, especially because I don't think I'm running disastrously over time. Uh, so in 66, the spring quarter, I was at Stanford on a teaching assignment, having essentially finished my thesis and so on. And I started going to church again at the Stanford Chapel on Easter 66. And things got real when I got appointed assistant professor at Princeton that fall, and I joined the local Episcopal church, who had still at that time a superb rector who unfortunately was all too soon made Bishop of Rochester. and replaced by somebody that was, shall we say, not up to his caliber, but it was still a good place. Uh, say, I started courting Elizabeth in 66, and it was a fairly dicey business, and I was sacked twice. But if one doesn't try to push the courtship, one can maintain friendship, and sometimes things come back together. It's the kind of thing which, if you push, you lose. And I've had friends who never learned that. Uh, I was then I got to be assistant professor at Princeton in September of '66. In December of '66, I made my first trip to Barrow, Colorado Island. The subject of that book, which is presumably circulating around or has temporarily ceased to circulate about. Uh, and I was invited back most mysteriously for the summer of 1967. Most mysteriously because they did have me give a talk. And as far as I could tell, nobody understood it. And nobody understood it because I hadn't yet learned how to talk properly. But then they decided that I was amusing and that I would be sent around the world at more or less at their expense with an assistant to compare the Panama's tropical forests with those elsewhere in the tropical world. I married Elizabeth in March of '68, and in July of '68, we set off on this trip to the Cote d'Ivoire, Madagascar, India, Malaya, 2 weeks of temperate zone in Australia, and then New Guinea and home. And that sealed the marriage. You don't think about relationships under those circumstances. You realize that either you hang together or you hang separately. And we learned how to hang together pretty quickly. And what was also helpful is that she enjoyed tropical nature just as much as I did. Uh, otherwise, otherwise we wouldn't have gotten married, is the answer to that. Uh, I was alternate semesters at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, which ran Barrow, Colorado Island, starting in the fall of '69, and then full time in '72 when I didn't get tenure at Princeton. I did research to celebrate the beauty of tropical nature and also to make sense of it, because if you realize the order behind it, you see its beauty better. My main theme was how the various forms of cooperation, either social cooperation within species like in a honeybee colony, or cooperation between members of different species, like between a plant and the roots on its fungi, which take up phosphorus from the soil in return for carbohydrates from the plant. Uh, they and these kinds of cooperation are essential to the productivity and diversity, both of tropical ecosystems as the one up here. Farmers would be very unhappy if all their pollinators died and all their root fungi ceased to do their job. It would be unpleasant. The thing about science is it took me out of myself, and it made me focus on and want to serve something outside of myself that was worthy to be praised with understanding. In '77, Elizabeth's youngest sister, Kate, married James Lind, son of Millard Lind. In the '70s, David Kane, the student I mentioned who introduced me to Lewis and Kierkegaard and so on and so forth, led me to books by Alexander Schmemann, an Orthodox liturgist and theologian. Absolutely first rate. I might say that he has written more perceptive and deeper analysis of the dangers Constantine posed to the Christian church than anybody else I've ever read, including John Howard Yoder. The funny thing is that he still believes that a social Christianity, even if it's a weak social Christianity, is better than being in a totally non-Christian society. But I never saw somebody more honest about his own church, still loyal, but fiercely honest than this gentleman Schmemann. His name was Alexander Schmemann, Schmemann. The crucial book is The Historical Road of Eastern Orthodoxy. In 1978, a son was born to us, John Murray, and in 1980, a daughter. In 1985, we made our third trip to Madagascar, and we were assigned a Madagascar colleague to work there who was a Christian, as was half her university's faculty. This is a completely different world from the U.S. Oh, it was the 150th anniversary of the London Missionary Society's translating the Bible into Malgache. And the Brits were smart. They put Malgache in charge of their churches as fast as they reasonably could. So when persecution came along, and the government did get interested in persecuting, and the Brits were expelled, the church was the Malgache's own church, and so the persecution fertilized it rather than destroying it. Oh, all our later trips to Madagascar were in collaboration with this good lady. Oh, in 1993, my son John was staying with the Lynns on the farm in Michigan, southern Michigan. Matthew Lind introduced him to Bethany, and he liked it. And Lizzie was desperately anxious to get the children out of the military schools that they were going to. Even though they were quite good military schools, they were not excessively military, and they had an extraordinary mixed student body, certainly by no means all Army people or even all Americans. So he went to 10th grade in Bethany that very fall. And in 1996, Mary entered 11th grade at Bethany, while John entered Goshen College. And Becky and Eber Rice Smucker hosted Mary her senior year at Bethany and took us all into their family. And we visited often. And this enabled me to call on Millard Lynn to learn more about the Old Testament, who used it to serve love, while so many use it to promote some wretched hatred or another. And so in Goshen, I generally attended college where the Rice Smuckers went, or assembly where my children went. I did somewhere along the line read The Politics of Jesus, which taught me how to read the New Testament, and Yoder's book on Sattler, which made me think about parallels with the early church. In 98, Mary entered Goshen College. In 2006, I had the impertinence to publish a review of Yoder's book on Anabaptism and Reformation in Switzerland. Oh, and I never knew about it for 12 years until trying to join something. I wanted to check out my bibliography, and I discovered, yes, this was listed among my publications. They had cut it by half, but it was a very Catholic journal, and they did not selectively cut out the anti-Catholic remarks. It was one of the really good and really honest editing job. In 2008, my wife died of a Guillain-Barre, which resulted from a neglected flu. In 2013, I began writing essay reviews of books relevant to religion science conflicts. I'm not very eager to convert people who believe the literal truth of the Bible to evolutionary thinking. I do have it in. I do have it in for intelligent designers who are looking for coercive proofs of God. And God wants our love, says the novelist Bernanos quite correctly, and love is a free choice or it is nothing. And you don't get love by coercive proofs. It's a poor way to go about it. Uh, then Millard Lynn died in 2015, and Becky and Egbert steered me to Leonard Gross for further theological conversation. In 2019, I left Panama for Baltimore. I weathered the coronavirus epidemic with my daughter in Baltimore, which was a good thing. We not only did we have each other, she constructed a quarantine family right off, 3 households totaling 5 people. So I got to have dinner in a company of 5 every week. And when one considers the number of people who nearly died of loneliness during that exercise, one realizes one's blessings when one runs into them. Uh, I was moved to Greencroft in 2023, and here I am going to Mennonite churches, but still struggling with the proper relation between how we serve and how we praise God, and divided between Mennonite and the more liturgical Episcopal worship. And Yoder quite rightly teaches us that behavior is primary, but some doctrines matter. I mean, St. Paul tells us that Jesus rose from the dead or our faith is vain. That's one doctrine that's not negotiable. And Gnosticism does distort faith, but contempt of the creator and of creation. And St. Irenaeus was certainly right to fight that as hard as he could. But so this problem of the proper interplay between doctrine and behavior is one of the puzzles of my life, and that is the end of my tale.
So I'm holding the mic in case anybody has questions.
Sort of a summary of what doctrines are.
But yeah, I was asking us for some sort of a summary of some of the doctrines that are most important to you at this stage.
I would start with a Nicene Creed, and I would remark immediately that the reason the Nicene Creed doesn't mention anything between the incarnation and the passion is that they were writing it to settle controversies, not to state the whole faith. And this has to be kept in mind. But so obviously, I think it's important to recognize the Trinity, which I think is already fairly evident in Irenaeus. Oh, and the great battle fought at Chalcedon over what it meant for Jesus to be truly human and truly divine all at once, I think also matters. I would probably stop about there because uh, St. Maximus the Confessor was very important, was, I think, quite right to insist that Jesus had to have a human will as well as a divine one. But when one surveys the history of the second 1,000 years of Christianity, an awful lot of people got martyred for doctrines that I do not think the differences were essential in any sense to salvation. I mean, this is what I'm sure spawned Yoder's remark, but it wasn't the only thing he did. The analogy with Judaism is is quite sound. Sorry, more answering you wanted. Probably didn't answer your questions, but
I have a question. Oh,
yes, ma'am.
well, I totally concur with you, the importance of helping students gain an appreciation for beauty, and that beauty and faith are they go together. So I would be curious to know what what you found to be the most beautiful. I know what songs I think are the most beautiful, what paintings I think are the most beautiful. Where have you found beauty expressed the best in your experience?
I bind unto myself today the strong name of the Trinity is one of them. Hymns of that grade, hymns that teach and don't just overflow with undisciplined squads of emotion. Then, of course, the musical settings of the masses and more particularly the Psalms really made an impression on me. Monteverdi set a psalm. It's now the second half of 116. I believed, although I was brought very low, I said in my excess, all men are liars. Lord, how can I thank thee for all the things you have done for me? Essentially, this wonderful juxtaposition, which I'm sure I'm not the only person who's felt. The almost immediate translation from complete annoyance with everything that's going on to suddenly a realization that there's really a lot out there to be thankful for right now. You don't have to rake it up. Yes.
Wait.
Bert, I'm impressed with your interest in reaching out to a wide variety of people. When he was alive, Millard Lind, and then Leonard Gross, and you reached out to my wife Marie and me for conversation, and others, Eber Rice Booker and others who are here in this class today, thank goodness. How is it that you, as a kind of newcomer to the Goshen community, found it in your interest to reach out and invite people to conversation? A lot of people don't do that, but you did. How? Tell us about your reaching out to people and to get acquainted with people you didn't know before.
Well, good luck. You know, uh, my youngest sister-in-law marries the son of Millard Lind. Well, they were in Scottdale at the time, and Elizabeth's family was centered very close to Scottdale. In fact, their mailing address of her middle sister is Scottdale to this very day. And so one automatically runs into Millard Lind, and because I don't know how to schmooze, and he's willing to be asked real questions, we have no trouble finding something to talk about. Then Mary winds up having as host parents the Rice Smuckers. Well, obviously, I visit Mary, and if one is going to visit Mary, one is not rude to one's host parents, especially when they're being extremely kind and willing to put up with one's company. And so they provided me both with their own company and a base from which I could visit Millard Lind and so on. Then they also saw my introduction to Leonard Gross, and they would credit that friendship as much to his tolerance of my questions as to any merit or otherwise of mine. And and because I have a good, both, I'm extremely grateful for how Goshen College handles my children. It's comment I would not. I mean, I don't have anything against Bethany, but it is Goshen who got my children on the right path. And Bethany's role was funneling into Goshen, which is really important. But Goshen gave them education both in terms of how to appreciate things, also how to behave. I will tell my church, our church in Baltimore, was Bishop tried to close it once, uh, sometime in 2018 or 2019. And I can't remember whether I was at the meeting or not. I think I was because John was, my son, was the only person who had the guts to get up and tell the bishop very politely but very firmly how wrongheaded he was being. And I am willing to blame Goshen College quite hardly with great thanks for his mustering the courage to do that at that time.
When and how did you first encounter the Sermon on the Mount, and what effect did that have on your faith?
You won't get much of an answer for that. I must have encountered it long before I can remember. And it certainly didn't make a step change. I mean, yes, it soaks in along with everything else. But the it may be that the first really serious study of the implication of the Sermon on the Mount that I ever engaged in was reading Yoder's Politics of Jesus, particularly the first edition, which is not bothered with answering criticisms which are not actually that much to the point.
What is striking to me, we've had many hours together, is you're a natural scientist by profession, and yet you take history and ideas, philosophy, Kierkegaard, and so on, seemingly equally. And this, as I said, is quite striking. And how do you bring the two together?
Well, being interested in science means being interested in things. And it doesn't have to be limited to being interested in scientific things. I mean, proper college education is supposed to do this to people. And in my case, I would say Princeton succeeded in doing it. They certainly offered the resources for it. And as my father pushing the virtues of a liberal education, and my willingness to go along with it and my long interest in history, it just happened. I mean, it wasn't something that one strove for. It was something that was interesting and, a good way to spend time.
What are your thoughts and hopes for November 5 and the year beyond?
Well, my hopes are that Trump is defeated reasonably decisively. And beyond that, I mean, yes, I would like to see the world, this particular world of the U.S. become more friendly to immigrants. I would wish that, however obliged we may be to defend Taiwan, that we not make the life rough for China when they're doing something that is actually useful to the world. In other words, I think the 100% tariff on Chinese electronic vehicles is gross. We might have to import them, install, enforce rules that they information on the use of these vehicles can't be relayed back to central headquarters in China, but that we ought also to have done that with Elon Musk. This shouldn't have been something new that was invented to deal with Chinese competition. In other words, you're dealing with somebody who is much more in favor of free trade than the current crowd, because free trade much more often than not, provides better jobs for poor people in other countries. And then, of course, although the Great Depression was before my time, the 2007 wasn't, and the response to the financial panic in 2007 was very careful not to repeat the Depression mistake of jacking up tariffs in all corners, which people feel made the Great Depression much worse than it had to be. That's probably a much more political answer than you wanted, but there it is.
I'm appreciative of the names you have given, people who have influenced you. I notice that you've forgotten to name some of the women who have influenced you, and I would appreciate hearing about them.
Well, one obvious answer to that is that I was fairly heavily influenced by my wife, but it would be rather difficult to analyze that in detail. I mean, it's just part of one's daily life from day to day. But it, if I had not met her, it would be fair to ask, if I had not met her, would I be a serious Christian today? And I don't have an answer to that question. And the it would take me a while to think of women other than at long reach had a direct influence in person. I mean, people like Joan of Arc, uh, whose saintly behavior during her trial is certainly part of my makeup, would be included among influences on how I see things. But I expect you're more interested in people whom I have met than people whom I have read.
Simone Weil.
That's true. I have started reading her stuff, and the idea that the Iliad is an analysis of force and all its evils is a good one, and one that would be, I think, interesting for Mennonites to consider.
Did everybody catch the name Simone Weil? The wonderful thing about her is she was Simone Weil. She was a French philosopher during the early part of the last century, and I echo Leonard and Bert's recommendation of her. And one of the nice things about her is she writes in short paragraphs that you have to really digest. So you can just read 4 or 5 lines or a paragraph and muse about it for days.
What was your wife's religious background and how did that influence you?
She was raised Presbyterian, and her remark, she went to Florida after graduating to work at an so-called agricultural experiment station in Gainesville. Actually, she was working for somebody who was doing a Florida. And where she was, she had access to a really good Episcopal church and not to a Presbyterian church. And she remarked that her Sunday school was good enough so that she could appreciate the superiority of the Episcopals over the Presbyterians. So, I mean, obviously, most of her influence on me was more behavior and trying to instill in me that very foreign virtue of self-control and such things. But it was, the children have every right to be grateful for the influence she exerted.
Thank you for making faith and faith and life together an interesting story. There was nothing boring about what you shared with us this morning. And we also, I think I speak safely on behalf of the class, we thank you for reaching out to a number of us. And I should say, I don't know where this book is and it's making its way around. If anybody wants to borrow it, he made that as a gift to me. So I would be glad to loan it to anybody that wants to look through and read his interesting text and see those beautiful pictures, especially of the howler monkeys. So this is it for our time today. We thank you for giving us a journey into your faith, which has stimulated our own. Thank you, and we're finished.
Well, thank you. And thanks the company for coming.